We spend many hours of the day when we haven't bodies. If we begin to practice mindfully and listening to our body, we can also begin to deeply inside the earth around us. We touch the earth and get illuminated from our bodies or from the body of the earth. We commonly thinking environment and we can deeply we see that the earth is a one for living reality. Often when we feel alone, we forget that we connect directly with the earth. When we bring mindfulness in our steps, these steps can bring touch in our bodies and the body of the earth. These steps can rescue us from alienation, connecting to our suffering. When we begin to breathe mindfully and listen to our bodies, we begin aware of feelings of suffering we be ignoring. We hold these feelings in our bodies as well as our minds. Our suffering has been trying to communicate with us to let us know that it's there. We have spent a lot of time and energy ignoring it. We begin breathing mindfulness, feeling is a loneliness, sadness, fear, and anxiety may come up. When that happens, we don't need to do anything. By the way, we can just continue to follow our impress and our breath. We don't tell our fear to go away. We recognize. We don't tell our anger to go away. We ignore it. This feeling is like a small try in our sleeves. Pick them up and hold them tenderly. Acknowledging our feelings and judging them and pushing them away. Embracing that for mindfulness is an act of homecoming. The suffering and our sisters. We know that the suffering inside us contains the suffering about fathers, our mothers, our ancestors that have a chance to get to touch and to breathe mindfulness, which can help them transforming suffering. That's why we have transmitting unresolved suffering to us. If we are able to understand the suffering and thereby transforming, we are healing our parents and our sisters as well as ourselves, as well as the suffering of the world, discrimination, exploitation, poverty, and fear cause a lot of suffering arose around us. Our suffering reflects the suffering in others who may motivated the desire to do something to go to suffering to the world. How can we do that without understanding the nature of suffering? If we understand the suffering, we will become much easier for us to understand the suffering of others and of the world. We may have intention to do something or be someone we can help the world suffer less, but less we can listen to and ignore our suffering, we will not really be able to help. Listening deeply. The amount of suffering inside us and around us can be overwhelming. Usually we don't like to touch with it because we believe it's our pleasant. The marketplace provides it was imaginable to help us to run away from ourselves. We consume all this paths to ignore our suffering in us. Even we are not hungry, we eat. When we touch, when we watch television, even the program is very good, we don't have the courage to turn it off because we know when we turn it off, we may have to go back to ourselves and get touched to our suffering inside. We consume because we don't need to consume because we're afraid from suffering inside us. There is a way of getting way to get in touch, to overwhelmed by it. We try to avoid suffering, but suffering is useful. We need suffering. Going back to listen and understand our suffering brings the birth of compassion and love. If we take the time to listen deeply to our suffering, we will be able to understand it. Any suffering that is not released and reconciled and continue until it's been understood and transformed, we carry with us not just our own suffering, but also our parents and our sisters. Get in touch with our suffering that has been passed down to us. Understand to our own suffering. Understanding suffering is right compassion. Love is born, and by the way, we suffer less. If we understand the nature and the roots of our suffering, the path leading sensation to our suffering, know the way out the path, places believe, and we no longer need to be afraid. Suffering brings happiness. Understanding suffering always brings compassion. If we don't understand suffering, we don't understand happiness. If we don't how to get good care of suffering, we won't know how to get care of our happiness. We need suffering to grow happiness. The fact is, suffering and happiness always go together. When we understand suffering, we will understand happiness. If we know how to handle suffering, we will know how to handle happiness and produce happiness. If we are lotuses to grow, compassion is born from the understand suffering. We also should know about our suffering, to listen to deeply and have a deep look. It's our nature. In doing so, we allow the energy and compassion to be born. When we energy our compassion is born, by the way, we suffer less. When we suffer less, we have compassion for ourselves. We can more easily understand our suffering in the our person and in the other world, and communication with others will be based our desire to understand rather the desire to prove ourselves right and make ourselves make better. We have only the intention to help. Understanding our own suffering help us understand others. By know a woman from Washington D.C. when we time to plan to suicide, and she couldn't see our any suffering in their feeling, in her feeling. She have no hope. She had a very difficult relationship with her husband and also for, from her children. She had a friend who could listen to her talks and deep listening and lovely speech. She refused because the Catholic and thought they'd listen to their teaching and to her faith, and she planned to kill herself. She telephoned her friend to say goodbye. Her friend said, "Before you killing yourself, come say goodbye to me. Take a taxi." She can't. She got there. The friend asked her for a favor to listen to the tape before she killed herself, and looked and said, "Alright, before dying, I will satisfy your wish." After listening to the tape, she curious and decided to go to a mindfulness retreat. At retreat, she began to really listen to her suffering. She thought that the only end to suffering is to kill herself. It's too painful to listen. When she learned how to press, she could be our suffering. She found that here created a lot of perceptions and the truth, a lot of anger. She thought that her husband and her family are created all her suffering, but now she thought that he co-responsible for her suffering. She she did she thought that her husband didn't have suffering, but now here understand she is quite different. She is able to see the suffering in her husband. When you see the suffering inside yourself, you can see the suffer in the other person, and you can see your part, responsibility in creating the suffering in yourself and in the other person. The night when she came back to retreat, she came and sat close to her husband. This is something is very new, coming and sitting in. She sat for a long time, and then she began to talk. She said, "I know you are suffering so much from the birth. For many years I couldn't help you. I made the situation worse. It wasn't my intention to make you suffering. It's just because we didn't understand you. I didn't see the suffering inside you. Tell me about your difficulties. Please, help me understand." She was able to use this kind of lovely speech. Her husband began to cry like a baby because so many years she had talked to him in a loving way. The relationship began very beautiful and began to love. It became resentment and argument in our communication. That night began the journey to conciliation. 2 weeks later, the couple came with their children to the store. Loving yourself is the basis for the compassion. We tend the things and only know to understand and love someone very well, that not be. If we have understood our own suffering and our perception, how we can understand the suffering in our person. We shouldn't be too sure to understand everything about the other person. We have to ask, do I understand myself enough? Do I understand my suffering and the truth? When we have something responding in our sin and our suffering, we begin to get better to understand and communicate with someone else. If we can accept yourself, if you hate yourself and get angry with yourself, how can you love another person and communicate love to him or her? Self-understanding is crucial to understand about another person, crucial for loving others. When you understood your suffering, we suffer less, and we were capable to understand another person's suffering much more easily. When you recognize the suffering in the other person and see how its suffering came about, compassion, we no longer have the desire to punish or blame the other person. You could listen deeply, and when you speak, there is compassion and understanding in your speech. The person who's speaking will feel much comfortable because there is understanding and love in your voice. Coming home to ourselves to understand our suffering and the roots is the first step. Once we understand our suffering and how it came about, we're in a position to communicate with others in such a way that they also suffer less. Our relationship begin to each of us to understand our own difficulties and aspirations and those of others. When you come truly to ourselves and listen to yourself, you can benefit from every moment to live. We can enjoy our moment with good internal communication facilitated by mindful breathing. You begin to understand yourself, understand your suffering, and understand your happiness. Knowing how to handle suffering, know at the same time how to produce happiness. If you're truly happy, we all benefit from happiness. We need happy people in this world. 3. The keys of communicators with others. As you connect with yourself, you begin to connect more deeply with other people. Without the first step, the second step is impossible. Don't neglect the results and time alone each day to communicate with yourself. All of us still happiness, perception, and suffering. We communicate with others. We should be aware that the suffering we have yet to heal and our perception are also there. If we can be aware from in-breath and out-breath, we will remember that one goal, compassion and communication, is help others suffer less. If we remember this, we've already succeeded. We already creating more joy and less suffering.